I've been asked to respond to the recent racial realist videos on YouTube, and after refusing several times will do so, though only partially and reluctantly. The reason for the reluctance is that these users cannot possibly mean what they are saying. For that reason alone, there are others which are obvious. There's no proper context for addressing the serious and very real scientific issues relating to genetics and intelligence. These users habitually and consistently claim that their claims are being misrepresented and that all of their various intellectual combatants are motivated purely by political ideology rather than any sort of scientific understanding. They do this while simultaneously committing the exact same sin they accuse of their opponents, namely of blurring the scientific terms to meet their ideology. That they do not mean what they say is clear from their continuously changing definitions of race. Race appears to be a truly magical concept in this debate. Race appears to simultaneously be implied by the terms genetic, heritable, natural, difference, and innate. These race ideas also have the mysterious property of being simultaneously a fluid and purely socially constructive concept, yet also have that amazing property of creating accurate, predictable, and consistent results about cognitive abilities. This would put it in splendid isolation as perhaps the only socially constructed idea that would have any sort of relevance on scientific understanding in human history. This is similar to their consistent statement that race is purely genetic, and yet have not identified any single genes or relevant genes which would mark such differences. Take, for example, this statement.
Nothing else is spread equally, so why assume that all human groups have exactly the same ratio of geniuses and knuckle-draggers? Is it reasonable to expect that populations which have been genetically separate for over 2,000 generations have somehow managed to ensure that they all have identical average IQs, identical propensity to violence, creativity, and ability to give and take orders? I would suggest that it is not impossible, but hardly likely, and certainly not unquestionably true.
This is perhaps the strongest example of straw manning potentially ever. The claim is not that people are exactly equal all of the time. That's not the burden that's on him either, to show that there's merely differences between people. The burden on him is to say that the genes responsible for creating the phenotypical differences in race, for instance skin color, hair color, bone structure, would be the exact same genes that are responsible for cognitive abilities, and we simply know that that's not true. And we know that that makes very little sense, period. That for whatever reason, that the same particular gene that would make my skin lighter would also make me more intelligent. There is absolutely no reason to think that. And for him to merely claim that there are differences in people is almost platitudinal. It's completely obvious. It doesn't present any positive evidence whatsoever on a genetic basis that the genes responsible for the phenotypical differences that he's measured and are agreed obvious to everyone would be the same ones that would create differences in cognitive abilities. But this speaks to their general attitude towards argumentation. They feel that these ideas that they're putting forward are entirely obvious and intuitive and provide absolutely no details which would allow us to investigate any further, and have explicitly, in some cases, in the case of Heruka, have rejected even the need to provide literature to support any of their claims. So they really are arguing out of intuition rather than any sort of scientific basis. So the accusation hurled forward from their side that they're being misunderstood for purely political reasons is not true. It's certainly not true in my case. In my case, I understand a lot about how brain development works, and I have absolutely no idea what they mean when they're saying that the genes responsible for skin color would be the same ones that affect memory. I know for a fact that that is not true. Anyone with any passing understanding of these topics at all, or even genetics, would understand that this is laughably ridiculous. We don't need the idea that everyone's equal. We only need the idea that there's a difference between the genes responsible for skin and those responsible for developing cognition. That should have been obvious to everyone.
If you take two people and you put them in an identical environment, any differences between them is going to be a result of genetic differences, because it can't be environmental differences because the environment is the same. So the more similar the environment that two people live in, the more we can ascribe the differences between them to genetics.
There are two main reasons why this is a ridiculous thing to say. Firstly, because it's entirely irrelevant. Genes are not one-to-one relationships to race. They've never come up with any sort of particular genes which would suggest that, and so even bringing up genetic studies is entirely out of the realm of the debate to begin with. But since they've brought it up, there are two main objections to this entirely naive and oversimplified version of the facts. Firstly, the evidence we'd have from neonatal hormone growth, that it's not merely the case that once a child is born, you can take its genetic material and then understand any differences as arising from purely environmental factors. That's really not a sophisticated understanding of the way organisms develop at all. Namely, because the organism develops for the most part inside the womb, and so any very slight chemical differences that take place there, even among twins, can have vast differences in the way the organism develops, in phenotypical, cognitive, and behavioral traits. That's been known for decades, and for them to not address that in any way is, again, ridiculous. But perhaps the more important objection to this would come from a more thorough understanding of genetics, which they've completely brushed aside. The development of the field of epigenetics would be incredibly important here. Epigenetics refers to the heritable changes in gene expression that occur without the alteration of DNA sequencing. These changes occur during the life of the organism and define whether a particular protein is actually selected or created according to an allele. There are two primary and interconnected genetic mechanisms: DNA methylation and covalent modification of histons. Now, really, when we're talking about those types of differences that occur during the life of the organism, we see that environment affects DNA directly. It is not merely a case of simply receiving your DNA material from your race and then going out into the environment. You change your DNA quite substantially during the life of the organism. Now, what makes this all the more relevant, of course, is that epigenetic material is mostly found, the ones that occur in the human genome, are mostly the ones responsible for neurological and cognitive function. So again, completely blanket ignoring the entire field of epigenetics and not having it occur in this debate at all up until now shows a lot of ignorance of the exact way in which genetics work on the organisms. So again, you'll forgive me if I'm quite frustrated when they're continuously accusing people of lacking scientific knowledge and yet ignoring entire boatloads of research that have contributed exactly on this topic. I also think it's really telling that the epigenetic research generally done and the way it was discovered in the first place was because of a very well-known disease, namely cancer. Now, cancer would be something that we'd term biological, yes? No one here, I would think, thinks that you learn to have cancer, that you pick it up in the schoolyard. It's not a virus. It's nothing like that. It's epigenetically created. It's also not something that you would expect to come out of the genome, because it would be very strongly selected against if it were a gene, because it kills you. And unless you think that everyone with brain cancer is contributing to some giant tumor competition, then I feel very confident in simply laughing at your ignorance of one of the most important developments in human genetics that directly impact areas of neurological development and particularly intelligence. I'll put up a paper on exactly this topic of the relationship between epigenetics and intelligence, and show that the relationship between environment and genetics are not as static as they claim they are. This has been a common enough type of response. The real issue that I think I've had, and why I wanted to make this video in the first place, was because I think there's a huge amount of hypocrisy in claiming that people like Skeptical Heretic are not understanding the scientific evidence, and yet they just bulldoze over entire swaths of evidence that directly contradict exactly what they're saying. They don't feel any need to provide scientific evidence to back up even very critical ideas for backing up their claims, things like intelligence, things like race, and define them in, again, truly magical and ridiculous, I think, ways. Their understanding of biology is wrong, their understanding of genetics is wrong, cognitive development is wrong, their understanding of race is like anti-scientific, if nothing else, because it's claimed repeatedly that we simply know that races exist, rather than having them point to any particular genetic markers. So in contrast, I think, to what they've claimed repeatedly, which is that everyone who's against them in this debate, fringe elements, has certainly claimed this. The person doing the racial surrealist video has claimed exactly this, that people who are against this racial realism do so only on the basis of political ideology, and rather than being motivated by pure scientific problems with these ideas. So if it hasn't been clear yet, I'm just going to identify very clearly right now my main objections to their points. One is on the basis of race. We have absolutely not an inkling of evidence to suggest that the genes responsible for phenotypical development on the body would be the exact same ones that are responsible for neurological development. Secondly, on heritability, environment is more important than they've recognized for the organism. You don't have a distinction between organism and environment. They largely impact each other quite significantly. And the two places I think that's most relevant are in the development of the fetus and in the progress of epigenetic material and the selection of histons. I would love to hear them address these points, because so far they've claimed repeatedly that their opponents are non-scientific or anti-scientific. I think the opposite is true. They've repeatedly claimed that they are the victims of scientific misunderstanding and that all of their opponents are purely motivated by politics. Again, I think the exact opposite is true. I think at core, and we saw this with Heruka, that there are political undertones to these ideas. She, first of all, claimed that there were obvious differences between races, but then went far afield from any sort of difference in then claiming that groups of people ought to be separated. The scientific literature that, again, they have, I should say, failed to point to doesn't back that up in any ways. I think this is as clear example as any of someone picking their evidence to fit their conclusions rather than picking their conclusions to fit the evidence. I await wholeheartedly the responses from any of these people, and I would love to know why the objections that I've put out and have been known in the literature for decades are not relevant to this discussion.